Understanding Sweden. Episode 4. The law doesn't protect those who stay silent. We tend to think that in Sweden, the law protects the weaker side, and that's almost true. But there's a condition nobody mentioned in our language classes. The law protects the person who takes part in it. If you stay silent, it doesn't protect you at all. It just keeps moving along on its own schedule. The story we'll start with is almost embarrassingly ordinary. Thursday, 5:30 in the evening, a woman named Miriam takes a white envelope with a little window out of her mailbox. She reads the letter 3 times and understands 4 words out of 10, but the main thing she understands right away. In 1 month, she has to move out of the apartment. Then she does what almost any of us would do. She puts the letter on the shelf by the mirror and tells herself she'll deal with it over the weekend. The weekend comes, the letter is still there, and nothing has changed except one thing: the clock is running. It runs steadily and silently, like the meter in the hallway, and it doesn't care whether we understood the text or not. Over the next 15 minutes, we'll go through exactly what kept moving while that envelope sat by the mirror. And we'll see that at almost every point in this story, Miriam had rights she didn't know about. You have to start at the top because from the bottom, it doesn't make sense. Sweden has ordinary laws. There are a lot of them, and they change. And then there are 4 laws that stand above all the rest. They're called the fundamental laws, and changing them was made difficult on purpose. 1 vote in parliament isn't enough. The idea behind this is simple. A fundamental law is a brake, and it kicks in exactly when everyone's in a hurry. 1 angry majority in 1 nervous year shouldn't get to rewrite the rules of the game for everybody. The first of the 4 is the form of government, and it contains a sentence worth remembering word for word. All public power in Sweden proceeds from the people. It sounds like a slogan, so let's bring it down to everyday life. A civil servant, a police officer, a government minister, none of them act on their own behalf. Their power is borrowed from us, and that's why it has limits. The same law sets out basic rights and freedoms, the role of the head of state, and the rules the public agencies work by. And it also contains something that surprises newcomers: the right to move freely in nature. Yes, you heard that right. The right to walk in the forest is protected by the Constitution in this country. The second fundamental law is the Freedom of the Press Act, and it protects the printed word: books, newspapers, magazines. The third is the fundamental law on freedom of expression, and it does the same job for radio, television, and every other form. The fourth is the Act of Succession, and it's about who inherits the throne. Notice something odd here. There's a separate fundamental law about the king, but none about healthcare. This isn't a list of today's priorities. It's what has piled up and settled over centuries. Layers of paint on an old door. Ordinary laws are passed by parliament. We'll call it Riksdagen. The government runs the country and proposes laws, and the agencies carry them out. Mixing up those 3 roles won't do us any favors. When the person behind the counter says, "That's the law," they're not showing off their power. They're telling you how little power they have. Let's take 3 things from this part, and you'll almost certainly meet them on the test. There are 4 fundamental laws: the form of government, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, and the Act of Succession. All public power proceeds from the people. That's a quote from the form of government. And the right to move freely in nature is protected by that same law. So how freely can we actually speak in a country where freedom of expression is written into the Constitution? Freely. But that freedom has an edge, and not knowing where the edge is can cost you. We can criticize the government, the king, the police, our boss, our neighbor. We can go to a demonstration, start an organization, or join one. That's protected by law, and nobody has the right to punish us for it. Now, here's what we can't do. We can't insult or slander a person, and we can't attack a group of people with our words because of their faith, their background, their skin color, their orientation. That second one has its own legal name: incitement against an ethnic or national group. Close to it is the idea of hate crime, and separately, we can't reveal things that damage the country's security, military secrets, for example. The line isn't drawn by how strongly we feel, it's drawn by what we do with our opinion. You can think anything. You can say, that religion isn't for me, that's fine too. But calling for hatred against the people of that religion, that's where it stops. The difference is whether what you say is aimed at an idea or at people. Online, exactly the same rules apply, even though it feels much more like nothing there has consequences. A case like this looks like any other case: police, prosecutor, court, sentence. And this, by the way, is where the Swedish habit comes from, calmly referring to the law in everyday conversation. For people here, it isn't something abstract out of a textbook. It's a working boundary, and everyone has a rough feel for where it is. There are two facts we'll need from this part. Freedom of the press and freedom of expression are protected by separate fundamental laws. And slander, incitement against an ethnic or national group, and hate crime are forbidden. Freedom of speech does not cover them. Now let's set the letter aside for a moment and look at something heavier, because here the order of the steps really matters. Imagine it's night. There's a police car, and someone is suspected of a crime. First, the police investigate, but they're not the ones who decide whether the case goes to court. That decision is made by the prosecution service, a separate authority, and that separation matters. The person who investigates and the person who brings the charge are different people with different responsibilities. A prosecutor can hold someone in custody for up to 72 hours, and that's the limit. If it needs to be longer, the matter goes to court, and it's the court that decides on detention. So the story of a man disappeared for a month with no trial simply isn't possible under Swedish law. And it's better to know that in advance, not on the night when you're frightened. There are 3 levels of courts in Sweden. The first is the tingsrätt. The second is the hovrätt, where you go if you don't agree with the first decision. The third is the Supreme Court, and very few cases get that far. So who actually sits in that room and decides our fate? Not just a judge in a robe. And this is the most underrated part of Swedish justice. In the tingsrätt, lay judges sit alongside the judge, ordinary people with no legal training. The judge knows the law, the lay judges know life, and together they reach a decision that can be explained to society. Children are a separate story. In Sweden, criminal responsibility starts at 15. If a person is younger than that, the case isn't handled by a court, but by social services. And there, the question isn't punishment. It's what happens next for the child and the family. And there's one consequence almost nobody thinks about in the moment. An entry in the criminal record can get in the way of finding a job, getting a driving license, getting citizenship. It outlives the event itself. If your language isn't strong enough, you have the right to an interpreter in court and the right to a defense lawyer. That's not a favor. It's part of what's called legal certainty here. Everyone is treated the same before the law, and everyone has the right to a fair trial. 4 things to remember. The prosecution service decides whether a case goes to court. A prosecutor can detain you for a maximum of 72 hours. Anything longer requires a court decision. There are 3 levels of courts: tingsrätt, hovrätt, and the Supreme Court. And in the tingsrätt, lay judges sit alongside the judge. Criminal responsibility begins at 15.
Let's come back to Mariam, because while that letter was sitting on the shelf, something else happened to her.
At work, they told her that customers were reluctant to deal with a woman in a headscarf, and they moved her to the back room, quieter, calmer, and out of sight. There's a precise legal name for this, and that name isn't an awkward situation. It's discrimination. Swedish law protects people on 7 grounds: sex, gender identity, ethnicity, religion, disability, sexual orientation, and age. And there's someone whose job it is to keep an eye on this: the discrimination ombudsman. He isn't Mariam's lawyer, and he won't settle her dispute with her boss for her. But these are exactly the kinds of cases he handles. So where did this whole structure of rights come from, and why does it look the way it does? It didn't grow in Sweden. In 1945, 51 countries created the United Nations, and in 1948 came the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with its 30 articles. Sweden builds on top of that foundation, but in a few places it goes noticeably further. Here are 3 of them. In 1979, Sweden became the first country in the world to ban hitting children. Since 2020, the Convention on the Rights of the Child isn't just signed here, it works as law. And buying sex is punishable, while selling it is not. The person who pays is punished, not the person who's paid. Marriage with a minor is forbidden, and no appeal to tradition changes that. There's also a consent law. Anyone who wants sex has to make sure the other person actually agrees, not simply that they aren't resisting. We need to talk separately about violence in the family, because this is the case where there's nowhere to run. The threat is inside the home. The National Work Against Violence and Honor-Based Oppression is handled by the Gender Equality Agency. On the ground, that work looks simpler and closer to home. The social services in your commune, women's shelters, the police. And there's one thing worth knowing before you ever need it. In Sweden, this is not a private family matter. The state is responsible for it. There's another subject people rarely say out loud: language. In the year 2000, Sweden recognized 5 national minorities: Jews, Roma, Sami, Swedish Finns, and Tornedalers. Their languages, Yiddish, Romanichib, Sami, Finnish, and Meänkieli, can be used when you deal with the authorities, in preschool, and in elderly care. And the Sami have their own elected parliament. And since we're talking about equality, it's worth remembering that the tolerance here is younger than it looks from the outside. Homosexuality only became legal in 1944. So equality in this country didn't just grow on its own. People fought for it, and not very long ago. 5 facts from these 2 parts. The UN was founded by 51 countries in 1945, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has 30 articles. The Discrimination Act protects against discrimination on 7 grounds, and the Discrimination Ombudsman watches over it. In 1979, Sweden was the first country in the world to ban hitting children, and since 2020, the Convention on the Rights of the Child has been law. Buying sex is punishable, selling it is not, and child marriage is forbidden. 5 national minorities were recognized in the year 2000, and homosexuality has been legal since 1944. Miriam did finally take the letter down off the shelf. Not on the weekend, though, but on a Wednesday, after a colleague said something very simple to her in the break room. You can challenge this. Until that moment, the word challenge had never even crossed her mind. A letter from an authority felt like something you don't argue with. Housing disputes in Sweden are handled by the rent tribunal, hyresnämnden. You can go there yourself. No lawyer, no money, just the letter in your hand and one sentence you've practiced in advance. I want my case to be reviewed. And that's how it went. The deadline turned out to be less rigid than she'd thought. Part of what they demanded had no real basis, and she kept the apartment. It's easy to say she got lucky, but that wouldn't be true. She didn't get lucky. She just stopped staying quiet. And in this country, the difference between those two things is measured in money and in nerves. We started with a claim. The law here doesn't protect the person who stays silent. Now you can test that claim against everything we've gone through. Mariam had rights at every single step. To challenge the deadline, to report discrimination, to ask for an interpreter, to take her case to the second instance. Not one of those rights switches itself on. So there are two things worth taking away. First, a letter sitting on the shelf doesn't get safer because we don't open it. It gets more expensive. Second, silence has a price, and deadlines have a calendar, and the calendar always beats hope. Next time we'll talk about money, work, contracts, wages, taxes, and what to do when a letter arrives with a number on it. That's where people lose the most. And that's also where it's easiest not to lose anything at all. That was the course Understanding Sweden. The material comes from the official citizenship test textbook. Nothing added, nothing left out.